In 1894, the Bureau of American Ethnology submitted its 12th annual report to the Smithsonian Institution. It was 742 pages long. It documented 8 years of field excavation across the Mississippi and Ohio river valleys, hundreds of mound sites, thousands of recovered artifacts, skeletal remains from dozens of excavations, catalogued, measured and assigned field reference numbers. 7 years later, in 1901, a revised institutional summary covered the same material. But 17 of those field references are not in it, neither reclassified nor relocated. This is what the record shows, and what it doesn't. The Bureau of American Ethnology was created by an Act of Congress in 1879. Its founding director was John Wesley Powell, the same man who had surveyed the Colorado River, who had lost his right arm at Shiloh, and who had spent the 1870s mapping terrain that the federal government needed understood before it could be managed. Powell was not a romantic, he was a cataloguer. He believed the continent's history could be systematized, and the Bureau was his instrument for doing that. What the Bureau was actually tasked with was documenting the physical and cultural evidence of North America's pre-European populations before that evidence disappeared. By 1882, Powell had commissioned a systematic survey of the earthen mounds that covered the eastern half of the continent, tens of thousands of them, some as wide as football fields, some reaching 40 or 50 feet in height. The man he assigned to lead that survey was Cyrus Thomas, an entomologist from Illinois who had no particular background in archaeology, but had a talent for organizing large amounts of data across multiple field agents working simultaneously. Over the next 8 years, Thomas coordinated teams that excavated more than 2,000 mounds across 24 states. Each field agent filed reports. They described what they found in sequence, the depth of the excavation, the soil composition, the artifacts recovered, and the human remains. The field reports were the raw data. They went to Thomas, who synthesized them into the annual reports, which went into the permanent institutional record. That chain, from field agent to synthesizer to report to permanent record, is where this story lives. Because at each step in that chain, a decision was being made about what constituted evidence, what constituted anomaly, and what constituted a finding significant enough to publish. And in the 1890s, there was one question that all of that decision-making was oriented around: the question of who built the mounds. For most of the 19th century, educated American opinion held that the mounds had not been built by the Native American peoples living on or near them. The theory was that a more advanced civilization, a lost race, had preceded the current indigenous populations and had eventually been destroyed or displaced by them. This was not a fringe position. It appeared in scientific journals, in congressional testimony, in the popular press. It was also, as Powell recognized, a theory with political utility. If the mounds were built by a vanished civilization rather than by the ancestors of the people currently being removed from their land, then that removal became, in the logic of the time, something other than what it was. Powell assigned Thomas to settle the question, not to investigate it. Thomas's 1894 report, all 742 pages of it, concluded that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples already identified in the archaeological and ethnological record. The lost race theory was wrong. The mounds belonged to a continuous human presence on the continent. That conclusion was correct by the standards of the evidence Thomas published. But the report Thomas published was not the same as the evidence his field agents collected. Across dozens of mound excavations, agents recorded skeletal remains. Most were consistent with the skeletal record of known populations: bone density, cranial measurements, femur length, all within expected ranges. But a subset of the findings were not. Agents from Ohio, Illinois, and West Virginia filed reports describing skeletal remains with femur lengths, cranial dimensions, and overall structural proportions that fell outside the ranges Thomas's report established as the baseline for comparison. These were not casual observations. The field agents were following a standardized measurement protocol. The numbers were what the numbers were. 17 of those filed anomalous records appear in the raw field correspondence and in preliminary cataloguing documents from the 1894 survey period. Thomas's published report references none of them. Thomas did not dispute them. He did not include them with a notation. He did not address them. They are simply absent. That is the first thing the record shows. The Bureau's field agents were not operating in silence. Mound excavations in the 1880s and 1890s attracted local attention. County newspapers covered them. When a site was opened near a town, the local editor often sent someone to watch. The coverage was routine. A reporter would note the depth of the excavation, the number of artifacts, and the condition of any remains. Between 1881 and 1896, newspapers across Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and West Virginia published accounts of mound excavations that described skeletal remains as unusually large. The language varies by paper. Some say great stature. Some give measurements. A report from Mound City, Ohio, in 1883 described femur bones measuring 9 inches longer than a man of 6 feet would produce. A West Virginia county paper in 1886 described a cranial vault from an excavation near the Kanawha River as markedly larger than any in the survey team's reference collection. These are not the accounts of excited amateurs. Several of the reports quote the field agents directly, by name and affiliation. One account names a bureau agent identifying himself as filing a formal record of the find. These newspaper accounts and the field correspondence from the same period describe the same findings in the same locations. The correspondence confirms the newspaper accounts. The newspaper accounts confirm the correspondence. What neither column connects to is Thomas's 1894 published synthesis. The question to sit with is not whether these remains were extraordinary. The question is why the gap exists between what was documented and what was published. There are two possible answers to that question. The first is that the anomalous records were errors. The field agents mismeasured. The newspaper reporters misquoted. The correspondence is full of mistakes that Thomas, reviewing the full dataset, correctly excluded. That is possible. The second possibility is that Thomas was managing the record toward a predetermined conclusion. Powell needed the mound builder question settled. Thomas settled it. The anomalous records did not fit the settlement. And institutions, when they are managing a conclusion, do not typically argue with inconvenient evidence. They simply do not include it. That brings us to 1901. John Wesley Powell died in September 1902. In the 2 years before his death, the Bureau underwent an administrative reorganization. The annual reports from this period reflect a different approach to the material. The 1894 Thomas report had been explicit about its methodology. It described how field reports were collected, how measurements were standardized, and how the synthesized conclusions were reached. The appendices were extensive. A researcher going back to the 1894 report could trace specific site findings to specific field agents and specific field correspondence. The post-1900 institutional summaries that reference the same material do not maintain that traceability. The cataloguing system changed. The field reference numbers that Thomas's 1894 report used to identify individual excavation records were retired. A new classification system was adopted, and the mapping between old field numbers and new classification numbers was never published. If you want to trace a specific 1894 field record forward into the post-1900 institutional archive, you cannot. The numbering system that would allow you to do it does not exist in the public record. The 17 anomalous records identified in the 1894 field correspondence carry field reference numbers from Thomas's original cataloguing system. Those numbers connect to nothing in the post-1900 record. The new system, whatever its contents, cannot be cross-referenced to them. That may be administrative. Reference systems change, institutions reorganize. But here is what did not get reorganized. The post-1900 summaries discussing skeletal remains from the Ohio and Mississippi Valley Mound surveys describe a consistent, normalized skeletal profile. The range is narrow. The outliers are absent. The description reads as if the anomalous records never existed. The description does not address them and then dismiss them. It does not flag them as disputed. It simply does not include them. The pattern is the same as in the 1894 Thomas synthesis. Field evidence collected, a published summary produced, and the anomalous material absent from both. And this did not happen in isolation. The Bureau of American Ethnology was not the only institution managing what the scientific record said about the pre-Columbian Americas in this period. The Smithsonian itself, the American Anthropological Association, and the network of state geological surveys that fed data to federal institutions were all, in this period, working within a common framework. That framework held that the pre-Columbian inhabitants of North America had been hunter-gatherers, or at most simple agriculturalists capable of building the mounds. Thomas had established that the framework did not accommodate evidence of anything more advanced. Findings that did not fit that framework had a consistent institutional fate. They were reclassified, quietly, into categories that did not require explaining, or they were not published, or they were noted in field correspondence and never advanced beyond it. The correspondence exists. The gap between the correspondence and the published record is measurable. In 1885, a field agent for the Ohio Geological Survey filed a report on an excavation near Newark, Ohio, describing structural features at a mound complex that did not match the interpretive model the survey was using for the region. The report was filed. It appears in the survey's internal catalogue. It does not appear in the survey's published findings for that year or for any subsequent year. In 1891, a researcher working under a Smithsonian commission in the Tennessee Valley submitted field notes describing architectural features in a partially excavated mound complex. The features were organised, layered, structural, inconsistent with the standard interpretation of mound construction technique. That submission is in the Smithsonian's Internal Correspondence Archive. The published report from that commission does not reference it. The pattern across these cases is not dramatic. There is no single moment of deliberate erasure. There is instead a consistent institutional practice of managing what the public record contains. Anomalous findings enter the internal record. Internal records do not translate to published reports. Published reports become the official history. The official history does not contain the anomalous findings. Researchers working from the official history find no anomalies. The official history appears to be confirmed. That loop is how institutional consensus maintains itself, through selection, not argument. The field correspondence is not entirely gone. Parts of the Bureau of American Ethnology's pre-1900 field correspondence survive in the Smithsonian's National Anthropological Archives. They are available to researchers. They have been accessed. The newspaper accounts survive in State Historical Society collections and in digitized newspaper archives. Cross-referencing them against the field correspondence is possible. Methodical work. And the 1894 Thomas report itself survives. All 742 pages, the appendices, the field agent attributions, the site reference numbers. What survives, in other words, is enough to see the shape of what was removed. The 17 anomalous field records are identifiable by site location, filing date, and field agent attribution in the correspondence. They are cross-referenceable to the newspaper accounts from the same locations and periods. They are confirmed by the field reference numbering in Thomas's 1894 system, and they are absent from the post-1900 institutional record. What you do with that depends on what you think institutions are. If you think institutions are neutral repositories of evidence, then the gap is an administrative accident. Reference systems change. Reports have scope limitations. Not everything makes it in. If you think institutions are managed toward conclusions, then the gap is a record of the managing. The mounds still stand. The correspondence still exists. The 17 field reference numbers still connect to dated excavation sites and field agent names. The 1901 record is silent about all of it. That silence is the record. The 17 field reference numbers now exist in two places: the 1894 field correspondence and this video. The 1901 institutional record still has nothing to say about them. The next entry in this series covers pre-Civil War infrastructure findings in the Ohio Valley. Same institutions, same period, a different category of evidence with the same shape of gap. Subscribe now. The next case is harder to explain away.